are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Although the election is over, the political news keeps coming and coming and coming. And who better to talk about that with than my good friend John Nichols? John Nichols, as you almost certainly know, is a national affairs correspondent for The Nation. He is the author of quite a few books. We don't have time to list them all here, but go get them and read them all. His latest is Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. And once again, John Nichols, welcome to the Zero Hour.
It's great to be with you, my friend. It's been too long.
It's been way too long. And let's start with this. I mean, the postmortems continue on the election. I remain a little baffled by the idea. It's better than the Democrats expected, which in my view is a good thing, but I still remain baffled when somebody takes a victory lap for that, because, losing one house of Congress against the scurviest bunch of pirates to ever take over a sailing ship is, to me, we ought to be able to do better than that. And it seems to me, we could talk about what the next 2 years may be like, but it seems to me there should be more critical self-analysis going on among Democrats. You think I'm being too harsh?
Nope, not at all. In fact, I agree with it 100%. Look, here's the bottom line on what happened in 2022. We thought it was going to be horrible. It turned out not to be as horrible as the pundits and the polls, some horrible, kind of really dysfunctional polling, or maybe intentionally deceptive polling, suggested. So we got a result that at the end of the day was, I think, better for the Republic than it might have been. However, this is the important thing to understand. The Democrats always fight the last battle, or maybe the last 10 battles. And so they went into the 2022 election cycle with midterm-itis, right? They were obsessed with the notion that it's a midterm, we can't possibly do well. Best we can do is not horrible. And so they fought a defensive battle. It was desperate at times. They couldn't even come up with the focus of their campaign. I mean, you literally had Republicans say, oh yeah, we're going to mess with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And the Democrats were like, I don't know, should we make that an issue? Right. I mean, they struggled to get a focus, and they were like, oh, we're going to focus on abortion. Oh, we're going to focus on democracy. Oh, we're going to, avoid talking about inflation. They bounced around so much. So their message was quite incoherent. And that was all part of a sort of desperate defensive campaign when they should have been running an offensive campaign, right? They should have been on the offense. And if they had been, I think they could have had a very different result. And let me give you an example of how and why. They got so scared for their incumbents, who were going to win without a question. Maggie Hassan up in New Hampshire, Patty Murray out in Washington in the Senate races, that they moved a lot of money there. Now, I understand that in politics, you move money to incumbents and stuff, but there was such a fear that they were going to lose seats that were very likely to be won, that resources didn't go at critical moments to places where they could have won. And so, as an example, in the month of September in Wisconsin, my state, Mandela Barnes, the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, was really badly outspent with a negative ad campaign that was, frankly, bluntly racist. It was an awful, awful campaign, but it really pounded on Barnes for week after week, and he ended up falling quite a ways down in the polls. Now, once the resources were there and he started, countering and being able to push, he started rising in the polls. He ended up losing to Ron Johnson by only 26,000 votes. That's a race Democrats could have won. And if you go over and look over in the House races, I can point to a good half dozen races, mostly in rural or semi-rural districts, where the Democratic campaign committees and big donors and associated PACs kind of pulled out. They didn't fight on the ground or on the airwaves. And in many of those districts, the Democratic candidate ended up getting 47, 48% of the vote. with a little bit more support, those candidates could have won, and we would be now talking about a situation where Democrats had held the House as well as the Senate.
And, I wonder, John, one of the candidates that came to mind for me as you were speaking was Jamie McLeod Skinner.
Perfect example. Yeah.
I wondered to what extent they were withholding, and this is maybe just me, but I wondered to what extent they were withholding funds because they wanted to concentrate on defending incumbents, and to what extent maybe they tactically withheld funds. I don't mean to lose, don't get me wrong, but that they were less inclined to support somebody who was so openly progressive. Jamie McLeod Skinner knocked off, so-called centrist Democrat in the primary and so on. I wonder to what extent any sense of ideology, I think what you say makes perfect sense, but I wonder to what extent also any overlay of ideology might have influenced their decision making.
Sure. Well, we know going back to 2006, I think, quite a long way back, that we've had a problem, I think, with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, where it has tended to be biased towards centrists, and even towards center-right candidates. And it's not every cycle, but you definitely see that in particular cycles. Look, Richard, I wrote a book about this, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. It's a history of the times where the party establishment, the party moneyed interests, the elites have undercut progressives, right? Even when it was to their own disadvantage. Now, does that mean that the establishment wants to lose? No. The establishment would back a progressive any day of the week if they thought that was essential to winning. I think that's bottom line of politics. But when they just look at their hierarchy of what they think can win or what they want to see win, they tend often towards centrists or center-right candidates. That's a mistake in places around the country. And so I think there's been a history of that we can point to again and again and again. However, I really don't want to underestimate stupidity. And the fact that in some cases the Democrats just blow it because they don't think things through in a very logical way. So it's, sometimes there's ideology, sometimes there's just bumbling. And what they did in some of these rural districts was just pure bumbling. They assumed that Trump and the Republicans had gotten so much traction in rural America that there was just no way to fight back, that they didn't even know how to do it. Well, they were wrong. They were flat out wrong. Again, I don't want to always cite Wisconsin, my state, but in Western Wisconsin, in the 3rd Congressional District, a district that has voted for the Democratic candidate for president in pretty much every race since 1988, but did vote for Trump. And so I don't want to underestimate. It's a swing district, but it had a Democratic congressman from 1996, has many Democratic legislators. It's a competitive district. The Republicans had a strong candidate, a vet who is very right-wing. The Democrats nominated a farm kid, a guy who was a state senator who grew up on a farm in the rural part of the district, wasn't a real flashy politician or anything like that. Well, the National Party completely pulled out. They put no resources in. And the farm kid got over 48% of the vote without any help. He was literally putting up his own barn signs, right? Uh-huh. And if the National Party had simply said, oh, yeah, maybe we could win a rural district, maybe that's possible, put in a little bit of resources, a little bit of support, they would have won that district. That would have been one seat more toward a Democratic majority. You do the McLeod-Skinner race out west, that's 2 seats. I can look at there's at least one district in Texas, kind of going up in, kind of rural and some urban areas in South Central Texas, where I think you would have had your 3rd seat. And if you want to keep going, I can go around the country.
Well, I'm sure you can. Yeah. But all of this points to me then to not only the ideology question that you wrote a book about, but I hate to use such a fuzzy word, but I think it's significant, a culture problem, right? That there is a situation where today's Democrats don't feel comfortable with certain segments of the population or whatever you want to call it. Or I think there's a culture, first of all, of confidence or lack thereof. And, but I also think that perhaps it's a culture excuse me if I take a second to explain what I mean, but I'd really like your thoughts on it. A culture that sees the world through a kind of two-dimensional left-right lens that doesn't reflect reality. In other words, that they think left is quote unquote woke, and which pronouns do you use? And they think right is, we're going to fix the economy for you, as opposed to a three-dimensional world where left can mean those things, but it can also mean left populism, which happens to be my ideology, but it can also mean, yeah, we're going to fix the economy for you. We care about you. We can talk to you. We get what it's like to work minimum wage, or we get what it's like to try to keep a family farm in Western Wisconsin, or whatever it might be, that there's a discomfort. And, maybe you can put some of it on contributor dollars and all of that, and the clash between what the big donors want and what voters like that want. But I feel like there's something else to it. I feel as if there's almost we don't know how to do that psychology. Well, yeah. Am I off base?
No, of course you're not. Look, I was born in a town of 970 people. I was 971. And that was one of the bigger communities members of my family had lived in. My mom grew up in a town of 500, and then she went off after that to live in a town of 200. And so my roots are in very, very rural areas. And what I can tell you is I know the people in those places. I was, just last weekend, I was out with my mom, who's 92, out in rural southwestern Wisconsin. And what I find in rural southwestern Wisconsin are people who are woke. Seriously. I mean, that's an important thing to understand. There are people who, really do try hard to embrace, all of the evolving and improving ways in which we relate to one another. Right. And there are people who are struggling economically, but are, don't buy Trump's lies, and fantasies there. They're there. There's also diversity. I think it's always important to point out that in rural America, you have still the majority of indigenous peoples live in rural America. That in the African American community, about a quarter of the African American community still lives in rural and semi-rural areas. The Latinx community, the Asian American communities are the boom communities in rural areas. So there's a lot of possibility there, and yet. I will tell you this right off the bat, and this is just one example. I mean, you're putting a bigger thing on the table, but one example is I'll just tell you the Democratic Party does not have a clue on how to go out and do rural organizing and how to work it. And if they did, they would win. They would not only win some more seats from rural areas, they would win more states. Because the fact of the matter is, the way that it works in a lot of America is that you've got a state's got a big city, maybe two big cities, which generate a lot of Democratic votes. Then there's some college towns that do the same. And Democrats may not always win rural areas, but if they can get 40, 45%, if they can get a good finish in the rural areas, then in combination, it all comes together. Now, the person who figured that out in 2022 was the one Democratic candidate who flipped a Republican seat, and that was John Fetterman. What did John Fetterman say? Every county, every vote. Fetterman literally went out of his way to go to rural counties where no Democrat had been for years. And I charted it. I did a piece on it for The Nation. In some places, like in the Erie area, which had gone for Trump at one point, in the Erie area, Fetterman was outperforming past Democratic performances by 10 percentage points. And in counties, very rural counties, it was 3, 5, 6, 7 percentage points. When you added that all up across the state, it was critical to his victory. And so the fact of the matter is you can do it. And how did Fetterman do it? Well, he talked about legalizing marijuana, which is very popular in urban and rural areas. He talked about criminal justice reform, which, we're told there's a big backlash against it. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of folks in urban and rural areas who've had run-ins with the law and challenges with it, and they want to be able to go forward. And then he talked a lot about being pro-union, pro-industrial worker, just kind of old line economic justice messages. It worked. And so the fact is, it's not really that complicated. But boy, if you go to a Democrat in Washington, D.C., a Democratic strategist or consultant or pollster, and you lay that out, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. And remember, they tried to beat Fetterman in his own primary.
Right. Of course they did, with their conception of what works, which is Connor Lamb. But what they forget about Representative Connor Lamb was that he won his district by, acting a little more like Fetterman than the consultants realized. I mean, he talked about Social Security, he talked about unions. So even, in a state like Pennsylvania, which has, these rural elements too, working class elements in the urban areas and places like York and so on, even there, even a quote unquote centrist has got to kind of nod to these, working people's left populist issues, right? So
especially on issues like trade policy.
What's that?
Especially on issues like trade policy,
right?
Which is Washington media and the consultant class doesn't even know how to talk about or think about trade policy. They don't recognize that across America, you have tens of millions of people who fully understand trade policy.
Right.
And what they understand is it closed their factory, it caused their town to wither. It didn't help them. That's their perception of it. Now, whether they're right or wrong, I happen to think they're generally right. But whether they're right or wrong, that's an understanding that runs deep in a lot of America. And yet, you still have Democrats who run away from those issues, right? Who run away from saying, look, we shouldn't close any more factories. We should be looking for ways to reindustrialize. We should have an industrial policy in this country that puts people back to work in cities and in small cities and small towns, because often, when we talk about a factory closing being devastating, well, a factory closing can be devastating and really rough on a city like Toledo or a city like Flint or a city like Utica. But there are small towns where a factory closing is everything.
Right.
It's they got one factory, right? There's not one of many. It's one. When it closes, there's nothing to replace it.
Well, that's right. And I don't understand this discomfort. I remember when I was working for our mutual friend Bernie in 2016, when the Trans-Pacific Partnership TPP agreement had been worked on by the Obama administration, and Trump was talking against it, and Hillary Clinton reversed her position and said she was now against it. But I remember consultants, professional Democratic advisors telling me voters don't know what the TPP is. But then you go out to states like Wisconsin. I don't know if you saw them, but I saw, maybe it was Michigan, that I saw yard signs that said F the TPP or words to that effect. So people knew exactly what it was, and they had very strong feelings, as you say, essentially correct about what it would do to their jobs, or probably correct. And yet it just, as you say, they were fighting the last battles. They didn't realize this was an issue they could run on and win.
Well, and Donald Trump did. The weird thing about Donald Trump is in his ignorance. One of the interesting things about Donald Trump is he's an incredibly ignorant man as regards politics. It's not, some people say he's stupid. Some people say he's great. They say whatever they want. That's not what I'm saying. It's just what I'm saying is he's really ignorant. He doesn't know the history of every political campaign for the last 30, 40 years, like you and I do, right?
Right.
And as a result, he's freed from having, we're like always piecing it apart, looking at all the little, he just looks at it in the broad sense, comes along and says, a lot of factories closed. People are angry about that. I think I'll say I won't do that.
Right. Of course. Right? He's a salesman, right? I mean,
as simplistic as that.
Yeah.
And yet it had an impact. And I think that the one thing I always try to emphasize when I'm talking to, especially folks in Washington, New York, LA, about politics is that what they desperately need to understand is that occasionally the unions actually are successful in education campaigns. And the most successful union education campaign of the last 50 years was about trade policy. It just was. I mean, UAW, steelworkers, and lots of other unions, CWA, they all focused on trade policy. They fought against NAFTA. They fought against most favored nation trading status for China. They fought against all sorts of trade deals in the 90s, the 2000s. That people got a lot of information about it. They understand it very, very well. And as a result, it's a much bigger issue in America than it is in the couple blocks of Washington, D.C., where the consultants get together, where the pundits and the pollsters and a lot of the media is. And I guess this brings us all back to 2022, because in 2022, if you had a good grip on, kind of the mood of the country, what you understood was the country was angry, frustrated, scared, but not necessarily ready to give power back to Donald Trump and the Republicans.
Right.
It's the subtlety of it all.
Right.
And it does require a different kind of campaigning. But I'll give you my biggest take on the 2022. If we're going to talk about errors of the Democrats, and again, we should acknowledge up front, Democrats did better than expected, right? More power to that, understand that. But here's a big error. You've got inflation, big inflation. It's real. People are feeling it.
Right.
And you happen to be in charge, but you don't have enough power to actually do the things that you should do, right? Not to pass the real Build Back Better, as Bernie Sanders outlined it, do some of the bigger things. And so how do you go at that? Well, it's not that hard, right? You say corporations, which actually figured out a way to profit off the pandemic, right? Are now, recording record profits and raising prices, right? Now, if I'm the Democrats, I say, give us some more power. We got a problem with a couple of our senators who won't let us do the things we need to do. Acknowledge it up front, level with people, say, if you can get us a couple more senators, we will go after that price gouging. We will go after those corporate thieves, robber barons, call them whatever, run a populist campaign against them. And then you suddenly got an argument that makes sense in this. And yet, as you well know, through most of 2022, if you said the word inflation, Democrats cleared the room.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I don't want don't
well,
talk to me like that.
And as a result, I think they felt highly reluctant to bring up, the things they had done, that child tax credit or whatever. They felt paralyzed to bring up anything that cost money because they didn't trust the voters to make the distinction between good expenditure, wasteful expenditure, what have you. But here, John, I have to say, this is where I do think it may be that the interests of donors and the political interests of the party, just in the abstract, it may come into conflict. That I agree with you. They could have done much better if they had said, look, give us a couple more senators. We'll pass one windfall profits tax. We'll restore the child tax credit. We'll do A, B, C, D, and E. But it may be that they felt that their sources of income, even excluding Sam Bankman-Fried or whomever, that their sources of income would dry up. I don't know to what extent that factors in their decision making.
I think we have to acknowledge that it factors in a huge way into their decision making, and because we have a constrained politics in America, we have a politics that plays within a very, very narrow field, right? And it should be expanded way out, right? Our politics in America should be comfortable, totally comfortable, in talking about single payer Medicare for all healthcare, because it's what everybody else does, right? In some form or another, they do a national healthcare plan. Our politics should be totally comfortable about talking about a national pension, not just Social Security, but a national pension. So when you get older, you're going to have security. Home care, all the healthcare stuff, all the things that people worry about. And the fact of the matter is, our politics is so constrained in America by corporate influence, right? Which it benefits tremendously by nothing changing, right? I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We're in a country where we have a massive redistribution of the wealth upwards that just keeps continuing year after year. We get hit by a pandemic. Everybody's supposed to share and sacrifice. No, the billionaires get massively richer. So we're in this country where that's what happens. And if you understand that, well, of course, you've got a natural constituency, the moneyed constituency, that says, don't change anything. Gridlock is great, right? They did a lot of the donors didn't like Trump because he was shaking things up too much. And for a lot of good reasons, they didn't like him. But they also don't want the Democrats to do a lot. right? What
Right.
they want is Democrats just sort of sit on power and manage things. And that has created a managerial Democratic Party, right? Democrats
Right.
are going to say,
Absolutely.
give
Yeah.
us power and we won't do a lot. We'll just kind of, we'll make sure things don't get too crazy. And the problem with that is that people don't want Trump's craziness, right? But that doesn't mean they don't want change.
Right.
And in 2022, I think if Democrats had recognized that just a little bit better, had a little bit more understanding of that, and that understanding obviously is constrained by the money, right? The money power.
Right.
If they had broken out of that, I think that Democrats would have held the House. I think that they probably would have won 2 more Senate seats. I'm thinking of Sherry Beasley down in North Carolina and Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin. I think they might have won another governorship or so. And we would have had a remarkably different narrative, even than we have now. The narrative of 2022 is that it went quite well for Democrats, much better than expected, right? But instead of patting yourself on the back and saying, wow, we did the impossible, couldn't have done any better than that. No, I think we have to be realistic and say, actually, they could have done quite a bit better. But the money power continues to constrain not just our politics in general, but I think the Democratic Party in particular.
And as if to underscore your point, John Nichols, the election is done. We're in the lame duck session now. And the railroad workers reject a deal, right? Which means, and not all the unions did, but enough that the possibility of a national railroad strike became real again. And what do the Democrats do? They immediately get together with Republicans and pass a bill blocking the strike. Then they separately pass, and one of the key issues in the strike, of course, being paid sick leave. And I don't know about you, but I don't want giant trains filled with toxic chemicals running through my town operated by people who can't get sick leave and have to work when they're not feeling well. It's just from a selfish point of view alone, I don't like that. And of course, from a worker solidarity point of view, it's horrible. So, that bill gets passed separately, but it seems to me as we speak and record this today on Thursday that first of all, it sends a bad message to the country, to working people, which says right away, these guys ain't on your side. And I know the logic, which is we can't afford another hit to the economy right now. Maybe I trust working people too much or something, but I think they would get it. First, number one, if there were a strike, and number two, why couldn't they pass one bill so that it can't be picked apart on the Senate side? One bill that gives them the sick leave they deserve as payment. The railroads are doing great. Corporate profits are at a 50-year high now. Why can't we do something about that?
Well, here's a simple deal. The railroads did not bargain in good faith, right?
Right.
And the unions tried. In that process, they got sort of a tentative deal, right? Which wasn't great. It was good. Actually, on the pay side, it was actually quite good. But on the human side, the work-life balance side, it was pretty lousy. Because one of the things that people don't understand about rail workers is that they're on call, right? And being on call is a really rough way to live your life, especially when you might be called in to then go across the whole country. You're not called into the office to work an extra 2 hours. You're getting on a train and going across the country. So when you start to understand it in that way, then rail workers, one of the things that makes their lives functional is to have paid sick leave, right? Enough of it so if you get sick, you can actually take off. The railroads hate that because they want these workers out, distant from their home. They may not be on a train going across the country. They may just be out in the countryside fixing some track or doing something like that. But the bottom line is they want those workers they want to put those workers in a place that is often distant from their home and that is often hard to get back home from, right? So if you got sick leave, right? You're going to get people home, then they're going to take their sick day. That's a challenge. The other thing they don't like is they don't like flexible schedule. They don't like a scheduling that allows people to have some definition of their lives, right? That you have a weekend and you know when the weekend is. They want to be able to call people in across the board. What they have done, what the railroad companies have done in this country is make massive profits by forcing workers to live a much more precarious life, right? You know, a much more challenging life. So what was needed in these contract negotiations, in addition to better pay, was better sick leave protections and better scheduling. It didn't happen. The workers looked at that pay bump, and unions representing roughly a majority of the workers involved in this said no. They said that's not satisfactory. We like the money, but our lives, we just can't take this anymore. This is too demanding, especially after COVID, everything like that. So they made a basic demand, right? And this is where the congressional intervention becomes so problematic. There's a cooling off period, right? That's a time when you're supposed to keep negotiating, right? The companies did not negotiate in good faith. Now you're getting to this point where, you know, the deadline of December 9th is coming. The workers are saying, yeah, we're ready to strike. And other unions, even some of the unions that had voted to accept the contract, are saying, we're going to respect the union. If they strike, we show solidarity. And suddenly the companies are terrified, right? This is a really bad situation. Now, one of two things happens in that moment. One is they go back into the negotiations and they actually give the workers something in negotiations to avoid that strike so they can keep making their billions of dollars, right? That's one prospect. Or second prospect, they go to Congress and they get Congress to impose the bad deal that the workers didn't want.
Right.
That second option, because they had that out. And what I would just simply say is Democrats shouldn't give them that out.
Of course not.
10 days to keep negotiating. They got the companies can negotiate a settlement here. And you know what? The weird thing about it is that the unions don't want to strike. Unions don't want to strike. Workers don't want to strike, especially going into Christmas. It's a hard thing to do. They would do it because they think it's necessary. But the fact of the matter is that in negotiations, if you gave them something, there's a good chance you can avert the strike. Now what we've ended up with is this situation where Congress is wading in and you know, they're doing it under the Railroad Labor Act of 1926, which allows them to do it. But that's supposed to promote labor peace, right? So if they're going to do it, the only way they should do it is to give the workers a baseline of what the workers have asked for.
Right.
And you don't do it in two votes, right? You don't say, well, here's the basic thing, Senate, and if you want to take the basic, jam the contract down the throats of the workers, you can do that. Or if you want it, you can do something better. It's a it's a Senate where the Republicans have the ability through the filibuster, through other tools, to define, how much is possible. It isn't going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. I shouldn't say that. I should say it is unlikely to happen. So we end up in this situation where the power of the federal government, controlled by the Democrats, is being used to prevent workers from getting something that they should be able to get.
And that they chose democratically. So a party that ran a large portion of its campaign on the principle of protecting democracy is using federal power to overrule the democratic decision of union members, which is not a good look.
That's not a good look. And here's an even worse look. Marco Rubio is running around saying we ought to respect the workers.
Right.
Now I'm too cynical, right? But I don't necessarily think of Marco Rubio as the great advocate for labor rights in America, right? I mean, this guy is a social and economic conservative who is taking, huge amounts of money from the big corporations. And yet he is running around saying, well, I don't think we should, overrule where the workers are at. He's actually on this one issue, right? Now, he may be doing it for cynical reasons. I don't know. But you tell me how that looks in the long term, right?
You bet.
When you got a Republican saying the things that should be said. Now, in fairness, Bernie Sanders is saying the right thing. So is Elizabeth Warren. So is Tammy Baldwin and Sherrod Brown. So there are Democrats too. I don't want to paint a false picture.
No, of course. No, but right.
It's Democrats have power. And if the settlement that comes out of this is that rail workers don't get their sick days, don't get more humane scheduling, then the end result is that federal intervention wasn't on behalf of the workers. It was on behalf of the CEOs. It was on behalf of the corporations and on behalf of the broader economy. I know we don't want the chaos of a labor strike. I understand all that, all the issues that might go with the strike. But, I think at the end of the day, we do have a divided politics in America. And one of the arguments going back to Franklin Roosevelt is that the workers have a party, the Democrats, that's supposed to look out for them. Well, sometimes you have to take a hit when you look out for the people that you're aligned with. And that hit might be to say to the CEOs and the big donors, to Warren Buffett and people like that, no, we're not going to make rail workers, sacrifice because it's the wrong time of year for a strike.
Well, first of all, John Nichols, I agree with every word you just said. Secondly, there are a million other things we could talk about, and we didn't even get to what a scurvy lot those Republicans are, or other things we could talk about. But I certainly hope we'll get the chance to do this again. Again, John Nichols is a Washington correspondent for The Nation, and as always, John, thanks for coming on the program. Great talking with you.
It's a great honor to be with you, my friend.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.